Hi, so I've been busy lately, so I haven't had a whole lot of time to prepare for this video, but last night I did find an interesting article on the Huffington Post, or HuffPost, I guess it is now. Don't know when that happened, but anyway, here is an article by a bona fide theological troublemaker, so it's gonna be good, I think. God does not exist. What atheists and Christians both get wrong about God. The God that most atheists think they reject is the God most Christians should. They think of God as a kind of big person, a category mistake which perpetuates misunderstanding. Okay, so right off the bat, this is sounding a lot like what I was taught growing up and still hear to this day. Atheists don't know the exact nature of God. They think that God is an actual physical being, but he's not. He's an ethereal spiritual being, which is even less verifiable. Quite frankly, I think it's an insult to my intelligence because I do understand the Christian view of God. I do understand that they don't believe that God is a physical being, but it helps them to say that, oh, they don't understand our beliefs, that's why they don't believe it. No, we do understand it, and your beliefs are still ridiculous. There are two kinds of atheists. One rejects belief in God for lack of evidence. The other does not accept belief in God for lack of evidence. The distinction is subtle. The first is more active, making a choice not to believe, whereas the other is more passive, not making the choice to believe. It's good to actually hear a Christian acknowledging this for once. It's important in most discussions, anyways, to understand that atheists don't all necessarily believe there is no God, but instead don't believe that there is. Now, for my purposes, I'm going to refer to an atheist who does not believe in God, but also doesn't claim to know whether or not he does, as an agnostic atheist, whereas I will refer to an atheist who claims that there is no God as a strong atheist, or a positive atheist, not a Gnostic atheist, because Gnosticism is a totally different thing. But let's continue. Both are united in their view that something should only be believed if there is evidence. Far too many Christians agree. I don't necessarily agree with that we should only believe in what there is evidence for, because if there isn't evidence for something, then it still may be the best explanation for the observations we do have. For example, we don't see any indication that there is a God, or at least I don't believe so. I'll argue with that in many a video. But if you see that there is no indication of a God, then the lack of the existence of a God would be a better explanation of this than the existence of a God who doesn't do anything. So it could be argued that believing there is no God is perfectly reasonable, even if it isn't proven. But in order to believe in something without evidence of that something, it needs to be the most reasonable explanation. So how do I know that God is? Because it sounds like you want me to accept that God exists without seeing evidence of it. How is that going to work? A common Christian response to unbelief is apologetics. It is the science of proving the claims of the Christian faith. Yada yada yada. It is all nonsense. Apologetics only convinces those already inclined to believe. It is good for making some Christians feel more legitimate, but terrible at convincing atheists. Atheists are right to point out that question-begging eyewitness testimony, historically questionable martyrdoms, and the occasional celestial blindness trap hardly prove anything. Okay, so far he seems to be on the right track. Apologists aren't convincing. There's a difference between strong atheism and negative atheism or agnostic atheism, so let's continue. Atheists sit around asking why God does not prove God's own existence. Apologists pace the floor, insisting that God does. Both assume that such a thing is even possible in the first place. Wait, so you believe that it's impossible for God to show that he exists? How is that the case? Surely if you believe in a God that is all-powerful and all-loving, he would want us to know that he exists so that we could actually have reason to believe that he does. Why wouldn't he do that? If the creation contains evidence of the creator, the evidence is not very convincing. So apologists are left saying that God wants us to at least have a little faith, and atheists rightly respond with, why? Both are making the same mistake. Both atheists and Christians are thinking about the deity as if it were a more powerful kind of human, like Zeus or Superman. See, I told you. Look, atheists who are familiar with the concept of Christianity will surely understand that Christians don't typically believe in an actual physically existing God, but instead a spiritual or ethereal God. But this guy seems to go a bit crazier than that. But God is not a being. He is not the highest being. God does not, technically speaking, exist. You exist, I exist. Our ideas of God also exist, but God is not in those ideas. God is beyond human conception. That from whence existence comes must be beyond existence itself. You cannot prove God exists because you cannot prove what is not true. Okay, so basically, of course you can't prove that God exists because God isn't the sort of being that you can prove he exists. But oh no, he has mysterious ways. We don't understand his nature. He's beyond our conception. That isn't very convincing. You're going to have a hard time convincing me that something exists of which I cannot comprehend it. Much less if there is no indication that that thing exists. But even if God doesn't have this physical existence, but has this weird magical thing that no one understands, surely he can still somehow show that he exists. Surely he can somehow influence the world in a way that is best explained by God existing, for lack of a better term. There being a God? If God created the universe, if he created everything in the physical realm, and he existed in a sort of different realm, he would still exist. I don't see how him creating the physical world would stop him from existing in a different way. But I guess that's the point, isn't it? His argument is that my argument is incomprehensible, so you can't really argue against it. At least that's what I'm getting from it so far. Nor can you prove God's own existence in a way that would satisfy either atheists or apologists. This is not because God is not all-powerful, and how very American and male, by the way, to focus on God's power. Okay, shut up for a minute, David. God's power is relevant to the discussion. If God is able to influence the world, then he is able to show us that he exists. And if so, why don't we see indication that he exists? Because if we don't see indication that he exists, or anything that is best explained by there being a God, there's no good reason to believe in him. So if he can show us that he exists, and he's not, then he's allowing us to disbelieve. And this lack of indication of a God is better explained by the lack of an existence of a God, and not your redefining of the word existence. There actually being no God. It is just the nature of things. Blah blah blah. God creates not because God chooses to create. Rather, creation is the consequence of God being God. We human beings think about things, make up our minds, ask questions, and choose some options over others. For God, there are no options in any meaningful sense of the word. By way of analogy, one might say that God could have chosen not to create, in much the same way that you or I could choose to eat a baby. Is it an option? Yes. Is it a live option? No. It is practically unthinkable. Okay, so God doesn't choose to do things, but there's a way that he does things and he's going to stick to them, I guess, because his existence is all weird. Okay, for one, how do you know that this is the case? Is this, stated in the Bible anywhere? Is there... How did you come to this conclusion? Is there actual reason to believe this, or is this just... you couldn't defend your beliefs, so you kept making it less and less verifiable? It seems like that's more likely to me, but I don't know. But that doesn't address the core issue that I have with belief in a God. There is no indication of a God, which is best explained by there being no God. There are vestiges of God in creation, but only for the eyes of faith. Creation is a kind of icon, a window to the divine. Faith is not reason, nor is faith the opposite of reason. The Christian tradition has always taught that faith is higher than reason. Faith is not belief despite evidence. Faith is falling in love. When you are in love, evidence is irrelevant. In this way, apologists do a great disservice to faith. You cannot argue someone into love. Okay, so if you have faith, then you interpret the world as being evidence of God. Okay, I'm still not convinced that faith is not belief despite evidence. That seems like it's exactly what it is. I'm really confused as to what you're trying to say here. It seems to me like he's saying, whether he intends to or not, is that faith is an interpretation of the world, feeling like you know more because you see things in this way. But there's still no indication that that is correct. I don't understand. St. Anselm described God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. This definition is constantly shaking the branches upon which the mind may come to rest. An apologist or atheist might imagine a God who can offer indubitable proof of God's existence. But theology conceives of something greater than that, a God so beyond human comprehension as to be nothing but dubitable. It is not God's fault. It is just the way it is. Okay, so God is so incomprehensible that we cannot know whether or not he exists. Why then should I believe in him? Such a complex, incomprehensible, unverifiable concept? There are better explanations for everything than that. In order to believe in something that grand, we need to have a grand indication of it. But we can't, because it's not possible. This is unreasonable. How is this supposed to be convincing to anyone? Is it supposed to be convincing? I don't even know. Atheists and apologists both fix their minds on anthropomorphic ideas about God, but evidence of God is just not possible, not in any meaningful way. You cannot prove your existence if you are beyond existence itself. Right, we cannot prove the existence of something that is beyond being verified. Why should I believe in it? And if you believe in what the Bible says, then it should be clear to you that God very well can, and supposedly did, influence the world and show that he existed. He walked and talked with Adam and Eve and Abraham. I think it was Jacob who prepared food for him. There are a number of times in the Bible where people heard voices from heaven. Surely God could still do that, right? Or did miracles just stop happening when we found out we could record them on video? Atheists and apologists each claim to be more reasonable than the other, but neither is. Both make a leap of faith. Agnosticism is a philosophically defensible position. There is nothing wrong with not being able to make up one's mind in the face of inconclusive evidence, but to believe or not to believe in that which cannot be known, that is a decision. Okay, wait, hold up. Maybe we can't know exactly the nature of this unverifiable God, but that doesn't mean that it's just, you can decide whether you believe in it or not. It's not just God may as well exist because he may as well not. No, this complex being existing is far less likely. If something is incredibly unbelievable, it's far more reasonable to believe that it doesn't exist than to believe that it does. Perhaps even more reasonable not to know, but even then, almost certainly does not. Neither the atheist who chooses not to believe in God on logical grounds, nor the apologist who tries to make the logical case for faith has reason to fault the other. They are both wrong in equal and opposite directions. I don't think that you've adequately demonstrated that. The atheist position, more or less, is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This is an extraordinary claim, so any evidence or lack thereof is okay to believe in it? No, the fact that your God is so complex that we can't even understand it or begin to think of how we can verify it or test it, that doesn't help your case. That just makes it worse, because that makes it harder to believe in, harder to be convinced of, at least to anyone who's not a child. That gives me far less reason to believe in it. Not only that, but far less reason for me to search to see whether or not this God exists. Because it's like, oh, you'll never find the answer, because God just can't give it to you. Surely you'll understand that that's not convincing. Oh, and yes, my ears are pierced, but I guess you figured that out by now, haven't you?